Welcome everyone to MHPN's October webinar and happy Archaeology Month. We are very excited today to have the three authors, Dean, Michael, and Krysta, to talk about their new book, The Historical Archaeology of Michigan. And before I turn it over to our speakers, I would like to go over some Zoom items. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box as you think of them. All the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And if the chat box will be used to share links or resources discussed during the webinar. Both the chat box and the Q&A box are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you don't see them, please wiggle your mouse. If this is your first time attending our webinar, we are the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. We support the sustainability and economic viability of Michigan's historic places through advocacy, education, and direct action. If you are not a member yet, please join us at www.mhpn.org. And if you're seeking AICP credits, you will need to log in your credit online after this event. I will drop this link in the chat in a little bit. And our webinar series are supported in part by an award from the Michigan Arts and Culture Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. We want to say a big thank you to our sponsors. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce you our speakers. So we will have Dean Anderson, retired state archaeologist for Michigan. And we will also be hearing from Krysta Ryzewski. She's a professor and chair of Wayne State University Department of Anthropology. Last but not least, we will be hearing from Michael Nassaney, and an emeritus professor of anthropology of Western Michigan University. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you, Sean. I'm going to share the screen for our presentation. So bear with me for a second. Let's see if it goes. It might take a second. Oh, there we go. Are you able to see the PowerPoint okay? Yes, okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. We're delighted to have so many interested folks attending the webinar today and to share a little bit about the content and the process and thinking behind our new book, The Historical Archaeology of Michigan. We're going to delve right into it by introducing a sneak preview of the book to you. The book will be published in January. If you're coming to the Society for Historical Archaeology conference in Detroit in January, you'll get to see it in the flesh and talk to us there. But you are the first audience to hear about the book and its content today. So I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Michael Nassaney, who's going to introduce the overall scope of the book.
Thank you, Krysta. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
And thank you for this opportunity to be able to talk about this project that's been in the works for several years now. Of course, Michigan has a very rich archaeological legacy, and this book allows us the opportunity to showcase that. And in the first slide here, I'll tell you a little bit more about, or in the next slide here, I'll tell you a little bit more about that archaeological legacy, or at least how we got started on this project. So the book is in the book series, The American Experience and Archaeological Perspective. And this is a series that I founded some years ago, and Krysta has been co-editing with me now. And we sought to highlight a number of themes in the American experience that have been foundational, that can be revealed, illuminated by archaeology. And after examining a number of different themes like cities and the fur trade and farmsteads and smoking and gender and collective action and labor and the working class, and the list goes on, we decided to begin to look at geographic spaces as well. Um, and Michigan was an obvious place to examine for a number of reasons. First off, the very rich heritage, as I mentioned before, that has been pursued archaeologically, as well as the close ties between the field of historical archaeology and the state of Michigan. One can say that even though the first meeting of the Society for Historical Archaeology was held in Texas, there were very important players from the state of Michigan who participated, who were in on the ground floor of that very important event, and a number of sites in Michigan that have been examined and have contributed not only to the method and theory of historical archaeology, but to ongoing developments in the field of historical archaeology. So we obviously introduced the book in our first chapter, and then in the second chapter, as the next slide will show, we look at some of the early pioneers in historical archaeology. And I think Dean knew actually and knows some of these very people that are in this image. Dean?
Some of them, yes. As Michael mentioned, a lot of historical archaeologists were going to put a date on the beginning of historical archaeology in the U.S. It was 1967 when there was a meeting held at Southern Methodist University that really launched the Society for Historical Archaeology. But before that date, there was a fairly considerable amount of historical period archaeology going on in particular. George Quimby, who's over on the far left of the slide, was active in looking at historical period sites back into the 1930s. And Quimby continued that work for several decades, and was clearly the foremost pioneers in historical archaeology in the state. It's also the case that Fort Michilimackinac, which you'll hear more about, work began at the fort, archaeological work began there, I believe, in 1959. And Lynn Evans, who's currently the curator of archaeology, is down in the lower left-hand side. That project, again, was well underway before the 1967 meeting at Southern Methodist. You have in the center there in the back row, second from the right, is Charles Cleland. And Cleland was one of the archaeologists from Michigan who was at the 1967 meeting, along with Arnold Pilling, who's in the lower right photograph. Bent down, he's showing an artifact to the assembled group there. Arnold and Chuck represented Michigan, and I believe Arnold then became the first secretary-treasurer for the Society for Historical Archaeology. And from that point on, a whole variety of archaeologists in the state have served in a variety of positions within the SHA in terms of board members, presidents, and those sorts of active administrative roles, always in support of the society and moving the society ahead. There's also been a variety of some of the people in this slide, especially Quimby and Cleland and Pilling, kind of represent a first generation of archaeologists in Michigan. And through the course of their work and teaching, they essentially led the way to a second generation of historical archaeologists that included people like Steve Demeter and Pat Martin, John Franzen, and others. So the legacy from that standpoint has gone on for many years. And something that we made a point of in the book was, although perhaps there's been not as much attention or underrepresentation of women in the field. Today, that situation has changed considerably, and there are a lot of women represented in historical archaeology. Sue Branchner, who passed away a few years ago, Stacy Camp, Lynn Evans, Krysta Ryzewski, Sarah Surface Evans, Stacy Brzezinski, and others, Misty Jackson. So we make a point of taking a look at that. And I think with that, Michael, we could go on to the next chapter.
Yeah, the next several chapters in the book sort of unfold chronologically, and again, the work in Michigan has been in lockstep with broader trends in the discipline. So, as many of you may know, early historical archaeologists were interested in often sort of the great men that were foundational to the history of our country. They're also interested in interactions between Europeans and indigenous peoples. So sort of focusing, if you will, on that latter piece. Of course, Michigan has several sites that were very important in early French exploration of the Great Lakes region. Michilimackinac, which has already been mentioned, the Detroit area at Fort Pontchartrain, and I think that earlier image was actually perhaps at the site there, although little, as it turns out, is actually remains of that particular place, and also Fort St. Joseph. So the Fort St. Joseph, that latter site, is a project that I've been associated with for some time, and I just point out the iconographic rings in the upper left in this slide to tie back to Quimby. So Quimby, as many of you know, was responsible for establishing a chronology for early historical sites in Michigan. His tripartite early, middle, and late historic period is still used to this day. And some of you may not know that his middle historic period was in fact based on collections that existed in Fort St. Joseph at the Fort St. Joseph Museum that he examined as early as the 1930s. So that has been a very important collection. And there are, again, while probably not nearly as much resources had gone into the site as at Michilimackinac, those two sites have been critical in understanding early French history and culture and interactions between Europeans and indigenous peoples in the region. Considerable time is spent in the book, of course, talking about Michilimackinac, arguably the jewel in the crown of historic preservation in the state of Michigan. Many of you know the site of the longest continuous historical archaeological investigations, arguably in the nation, if not in the world. And the work continues to go there, leading to reconstruction and interpretation. And much of those data are presented in the book. And some comparative work as well with other sites like Fort St. Joseph are an important part of that story. I'd also add that, of course, understanding that early period, we would be remiss if we did not include insights into the historical archaeology of native peoples in the region. And I think the next slide in the next chapter showcases that. And although we discuss and start this chapter by talking about the contestation that took place in the early historic period, if you will, into the beginning of the 19th century, with much of Michigan's lands being ceded to the U.S. government. Nevertheless, native peoples, as archaeology demonstrates, were resilient, they were persistent, and in fact, they were enduring on the landscape. And archaeology has played a role in locating these sites, interpreting these sites, and we discuss those sites as well in the book. And contra to earlier interpretations, which saw Europeans as dominant in every way, as the donor culture and so on in these earlier acculturation models. It's quite clear that Native peoples were selective, they were strategic, and as I said, we know today that there are at least 3 federally recognized tribes in the southwest corner of the state, but 12 federally recognized tribes statewide. And they all had to submit to careful scrutiny that allowed them to demonstrate, that required them to demonstrate their continuity. And so that in and of itself is testimony to their persistence. And the archaeology, when seen through that lens, when we center the Native experience, appears much differently than it was interpreted in earlier periods. So by the end of this chapter, we're right on the verge of statehood, and the next chapter talks about what Michigan looked like just as we're approaching statehood. And Dean will tell us a little more about that.
So in chapter 5, we begin to look at the real beginnings of settlement in Michigan. And in the early part of the 19th century, especially with the opening of the Erie Canal, settlers coming into Michigan from the east were moving into the southern part of the state, in particular, having to brave passing through northwestern Ohio and what was known as the Black Swamp, and getting into what was sometimes referred to as faraway Michigan. The southern tier of counties in Michigan began to be settled and turned into agricultural land. The forests were being cleared sufficiently to develop fields, and agriculture was one of the beginning economic pursuits in Michigan at the beginning of the 19th century, as Michigan begins to develop a relatively diverse economy through the course of those early decades. Along with the agricultural development, logging began to take place. Commercial logging began in Michigan, essentially in its earliest form across an east-west band that goes roughly from the base of Saginaw Bay across to the western part of the state. That commercial logging was beginning in the first quarter to first half of the 19th century, and then moved north from there for the most part. A lot of the logging activity that took place in Michigan during this time period was in the Upper Peninsula, and a great deal of archaeological research about logging has taken place in that part of the state. And there is a volume in the series that Michael introduced at the beginning by John Franzen about the archaeology of logging that goes into great detail about that, and we use some of that material in the book. Talk about that. About the same time, we see the beginning of mining taking place in Michigan again, especially in the UP, both copper mining and iron mining. Copper mining up in the Iron Country and Keweenaw Peninsula and the adjacent counties to the south and west, and iron mining a little bit further east in the Upper Peninsula. And we look at some of the archaeological sites that convey and portray those economic activities. There's, along with the development of those economies, there was the need for transportation in the state, and we look at the development of to some extent, trail systems that existed before any Europeans arrived, and how those trail systems were the beginnings of more formal forms of transportation. In some cases, plank roads were developed that followed those trail systems, especially across the southern part of the state, and connected the communities that were developing in that part of the state. Eventually, more formal roadways were connecting communities, and we see the development of taverns. We talk about Walker Tavern and some of the sorts of shops that developed along those roadways as well. And the photo that's in the that's on the slide that's up is a photo of the excavation of a shipwreck that's referred to as the Millicokin's wreck. We've never been able to determine the identity of that particular wreck, but wreck that we would call a near shore wreck. It's not really quite underwater. It's embedded in the sand just off the edge of the Millicokin, mouth of the Millicokin River, and gives you a good look at both the excavation of a shipwreck that's not quite underwater looks like. They're also probably the first true underwater excavation of a wreck site took place in Lake Michigan with the excavation of the Rockaway, a 19th century, mid-19th century vessel that was excavated by Ken Pott in the 70s. And part of what is really striking about the underwater situation with Michigan is, of course, the peninsula surrounded by 4 Great Lakes, and there are 38,000 square miles of Great Lakes bottomlands that are state land for the state of Michigan. So there's a lot of archaeological sites on those bottomlands. And I will just mention that the image to the right of the wreck site is a label from a tea chest that was found on the Millicokin wreck, which indicated that this was tea in a chest that actually came ultimately from China. So even back at that point in time, people in the UP had access to some fairly exotic resources and products. I'll leave it at that, Michael.
I know Krysta's going to talk about urban archaeology, so go
Yeah.
Krysta.
All right, so kind of shifting gears here. In our 6th chapter, we focus on urban archaeology, but specifically the case study of urban archaeology in Detroit. There have been archaeological investigations conducted in most major cities, I should say, in Michigan, but nowhere compares to the scale and temporal depth as the archaeological record of Detroit. And the story of urban archaeology in Detroit really begins with Arnold Pilling, who you met several slides ago, a couple chapters ago. He was a professor at Wayne State University in Detroit. And shortly after he arrived to Wayne State in the 1950s, he embarked on a number of survey projects, and then the very first excavation of a historic period site at the Michigan Consolidated Gas Company building site at the corner of Woodward Avenue and Jefferson, the Yamasaki building for our historic preservation friends here. And he demonstrated something really important that was a great source of debate at the time, which is that earlier archaeological remains from the 19th century and even the 18th century still existed intact and well preserved beneath the city streets. So this is the 1950s. Detroit is at its peak population. There's skyscrapers from the early 20th century all over the place downtown, and there were still building campaigns going on. So Pilling and his students and volunteers from the Michigan Archaeological Society were extremely active during the 1960s in salvage archaeology projects, one step ahead of the bulldozers in advance of constructing or demolishing various buildings in and around downtown Detroit. He established a structure for conducting contract archaeology with different property owners and developers. And that was well in place before the advent of what we know today as the cultural resource management industry, which was really initiated in the late 1960s after the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act. So very much Pilling was very much a trailblazer in the practice of urban archaeology. He had the nickname skyscraper archaeologist, in fact. Generations of his students at Wayne State went on to play key roles in the CRM scene in Michigan and nationally as well, Steve Demeter being one of the most prominent. And Demeter was involved in directing the excavations at the Renaissance Center site, artifacts from which you see here in 1973 and 1974. These excavations were developer funded. They were funded by a contract from the Ford Motor Company. And they involved clearing an area of 9 city blocks right along the Detroit riverfront. And the archaeology team targeted about 24 privy and midden features, and were able to retrieve an enormously valuable collection of early to mid 19th century material culture with great archaeological context associated with them and documents. So allowed insights into the development of the city, questions comparing living conditions, class, consumption, trade, you name it. And you'll notice that these artifacts are very well preserved, and that is because the geology of Detroit is rich with clay, which creates an anaerobic environment that preserves things like leather shoes and thread and bone buttons and spools. So these are, the Renaissance Center collection has about just shy of 20,000 artifacts in it. It's housed at Wayne State's Museum of Anthropology and is one of about 36 major CRM excavation collections that are housed in the Grosscup Museum. And because these were salvage excavations or contract excavations, there wasn't usually money and time baked into them, the scope of the projects, to do further analysis. So I mentioned this as a point that we emphasize in the book, the importance of stewarding these collections and conducting collections-based research. So even though the Renaissance Center materials were recovered in the 70s and students at the time produced theses and research papers on aspects of it, the research continues today, and these are still valuable collections that have a lot that hasn't been brought to light yet. And in the bottom right of the picture here, in case you're not familiar with what a 19th century privy looks like, here's a luxurious 2-seater privy. Don't ask me how that worked, but there's several examples of these from the Rensen collections. And like the example Dean just showed from the shipwreck, the Millikalkins wreck, we see evidence that by the 1830s, Detroit was very much connected to networks of global trade. You're looking here at pottery that was produced in the Staffordshire district of England, white clay pipe stems that were produced in Canada and Scotland, and other materials. So some really interesting global connections coming out of these Detroit-based traditional archaeological excavations. And those types of excavations continue apace today, both from a research focus and a cultural resource management focus, but so too do other types of investigations that have increasingly dealt with the 20th century, and standing building remains. So one of the great examples of that is the investigations at the Bluebird and Jazz Club in Detroit, where at first the nonprofit and the preservation partners weren't so sure what archaeology had to contribute to standing structure. And of course, there's a whole story to be told there about a document cache in the ceiling and artifacts retrieved from under floorboards. But this was a great demonstration of how archaeology could be put to use in investigating Black business networks, because the owners of the Bluebird and Jazz Club were an African-American family who came up from Alabama and were deeply connected to the business networks and people in the Paradise Valley neighborhood of Detroit, which was destroyed by urban renewal. And there hasn't been an opportunity to do archaeology there. So this business on the west side of Detroit informed not only details about what happened on the music scene and in a Black business operation, but also the wider network of entrepreneurship in the African-American community in the mid 20th century. So that I snuck 2 slides in there to show you how, through the example of Detroit, the practice of archaeology in Michigan has grown and changed and evolved over time from just survey and excavation to more 20th century sites and standing buildings. And another way it's evolved in really important and indispensable ways is through collaborative and community-based archaeology. And that is the focus of our last substantive case study chapter in the book. And here we highlight a handful of different collaborative archaeology projects to give readers a sense of the different forms, outcomes, intentions, and collaborations that center around archaeology in Michigan. You're looking at the slides from, or pictures from, the Malcolm X House project here that my students and I have been part of in the Detroit suburb of Inkster for about 5 years now. This is a project that was established and driven by the local community. Also in the chapter, there's a detailed discussion of the Fort St. Joseph archaeology project, which has been going on for decades now, and how that's grown and changed over time, how they've interacted with stakeholders and descendants. We also highlight the work that Sarah Surface Evans and her collaborators have done at the Mount Pleasant Industrial Indian Boarding School and the Campus Archaeology Project at Michigan State University. And we refer to others as well. So hopefully in that chapter, folks can have a kind of appreciate the breadth of collaborative and community archaeology in Michigan and see some of the ways that it's made impacts both locally and statewide. One point I think that's important to make in kind of rounding out the discussion of these case study chapters is that this book is not written in a way where it's intended to be an encyclopedia of Michigan historical archaeology. The books in the series are meant to be introduction to key themes and topics and case study sites. So this is an excellent starting point and reference volume for those of you who want to get a good idea of the depth and breadth of Michigan historical archaeology. But it's not necessarily a deep dive into every single site that historical archaeologists have studied and written about, although we took great pains to reference as much scholarship as we could. So I just wanted to touch upon that before we kind of wrap things up with a broader view in our concluding chapter 8. And I'll kick it back to Michael for that.
Yeah, thanks, Krysta. So certainly in a meager 200 pages, that kind of encyclopedic treatment would not be possible. But nevertheless, we see this as sort of a go-to volume for anyone who really wants to know something about Michigan historical archaeology. This is the starting place, we would argue, extensive bibliography. And to reiterate maybe some of what was said, again, the work that's been done in Michigan is been done parallel to the work that's been conducted in historical archaeology more broadly across the country and beyond. So various themes like collaborative archaeology and decolonization and urban studies and various methodological breakthroughs in underwater work and so forth. These are all part of the heritage of the historical archaeology of Michigan. Likewise, Michigan historical archaeology, or Michigan as a place, can be seen as a microcosm of the larger American experience. And this is something that we emphasize as well. So while it's different than other places in the lower 48, or for that matter in North America, there are distinctive aspects of it, even as it shares in these sort of broader Americanist trends, however defined. And as I mentioned, the contributions to historical archaeology continue to be significant. We point out in the last chapter too, some of the maybe future directions, or at least maybe some areas that need to be rectified within the field as well. While the discipline as a practice has been diversified along gender lines, issues of race and racialization are still really not central, we would argue, to the work being done in the state. And these are important directions that the discipline needs to go move into as we truly look to see how diverse the state was, looking at the archaeological records of groups that have not been examined that way, to create a more inclusive study. And as we are often fond of saying in the series, to work towards creating that more perfect union that we see as the American experience. So that's our book. We're sticking to it. Then we might have a couple other questions. Of course, acknowledgements. You know, lots of this was vetted by other colleagues. We relied on them for citations and information, you know, bibliographic sources and unpublished manuscripts and the like. You should also note, big red arrow, that this book can now be ordered, pre-ordered, at half the price that it will originally cost. So there is a code, and I think that information maybe will be provided in the chat as well. But we urge you to get a hold of this, and we look forward to your comments and questions. Let me just say also, and then let me turn it back to my office, because I know we have another few minutes before we let you in for your comments and questions. When this book was initially conceived, I invited Dean to write the book as the former state archaeologist with expertise in historical archaeology. And at the time, perhaps he balked at it a bit. And it occurred to me that this would be an ideal opportunity for he and Krysta and I to collaborate in the writing of this book. And it's really been a pleasure to do so. And I think we were positioned in such a way that we've been able to create a book that I think will have a long shelf life. Certainly in my limited expertise in Southwest Michigan, I wasn't in a position I mean, it's an enormous literature in the state, as you can imagine. So each of us had a little piece of this, if you will. And I think together we were able to complement each other. So Dean's ability to, having visited many of the sites throughout the state, in the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula and so on, and Krysta's extremely in-depth, figuratively and literally, work in Detroit and areas surrounding and so on. And then some of the projects I've worked on in Southwest Michigan, the Southwest Michigan Historic Landscape Project, as well as the Fort St. Joseph Project, and some of my interests in the 18th and 19th century, I think really positioned us to be able to tell a fairly complete story of the historical archaeology of Michigan. So I wanted to just end with that. And I will ask Dean and Krysta for any final comments they might have before we open it up for questions or whatever else they'd like to say.
I would only echo what Michael just said. And in fact, he's got that exactly right. I retired in May of 2019, and I think it was early 2020 when Michael called me up and I wonder if you'd be interested in doing a book on the historical archaeology of Michigan for the series. And I mulled that over, and as he said, called him back and said, no, that sounds like a big time-consuming project, and I just retired. And a day or two later, he called me back and said, what about if we co-author between me, Michael, and Krysta? And I thought, well, that removes a little bit of the intimidation of the project. I was interested in it, so I said, sure. And I would say that clearly the book is a much better product, the three of us, than I ever could have done. And this has been fun and educational, and I'm certainly really pleased with how this all turned out.
I don't think we could have written the book without you, Dean. You brought to the table such a wealth of knowledge from your experience working as the state archaeologist. And for those of you who are on the webinar who don't work in archaeology or only work in academic archaeology, we often have no idea how much information is housed in the gray literature, the unpublished literature that our colleagues in government and CRM offices manage. And so you were able to bring to the table a whole bunch of new insights and references that I think will really advance the scholarship of historical archaeology in Michigan moving forward. So it's a great trove of resources. But it was a fun experience and interesting to bring together. I think, what did we compute? Something like 75 or 80 years worth of professional experience into one volume. So we hope you all enjoy reading it. And I see lots of questions here in the chat, Jahan. So some of them are better than ours. I will point out one thing from the Q&A that I meant to mention during the community archaeology slide, and that's that the Malcolm X House is receiving its historic marker this Saturday at noon. So if any of you are in or around Inkster, this was an evolving case study, and there's always new things happening. Somebody put that in the chat. Thank you. So shout out to them. But should we go to the Q&A? I think we touched upon a lot of our key talking points. So
I think we should, but let me just reiterate also that at the upcoming meeting that Krysta mentioned in Detroit, the Conference on Historical and Underwater Archaeology will be in Detroit the first full week of January. And there will be a panel that Dean and I have organized on traversing historical archaeology in Michigan. That will dive into a lot of these topics in greater details, and you actually get to hear from some of the people who did the original research. And as Krysta reminded us the other day, there's a plenary session as well that will focus on Michigan archaeology, as well as a number of other symposia, poster sessions, and so on. So there'll be a deep dive into Michigan archaeology at this upcoming meeting in January. Hope to see you there.
Yes, and MHPN is a sponsor of the Society for Historical Archaeology meetings. So I am comfortable with promoting the registration for the SHA, which is now open. You can go to the sha.org website and register your participation. With that, let's move on to the Q&A. There's a lot of great questions.
Thank you so much for presentation, and thank you so much for taking us to a sneak peek of your book. And I think a lot of people are very excited about this book now. And let's start with this question here. What do you most hope readers to take away from this book?
Well, let me launch in, and I'll keep it brief, and then others can also answer. I think we addressed some of this. That there's a long history of scholarship in historical archaeology in Michigan. Michigan has played a very prominent role and continues to do so. And again, this is maybe goes without saying for those of you who know historical archaeology, but as a colleague often quips, history is too important to be left to historians. And the archaeology that's been done in the state forces us to confront often difficult and contested past and look at it in different ways and so forth. And so that's the centrality of archaeology and why it's so important. And I think folks will get a sense of how that played out in Michigan.
I would add that among historical archaeologists, there's a long-standing idea about the strength and the power of historical archaeology that in no small part comes from access to the documentary record and the archaeological record. And early on in historical archaeology, there was quite a lively debate about whether or not the archaeological study of historical period sites which have a documentary record look at, whether the archaeology really had much else to add to it. And we've certainly known over the years that archaeology has a lot to say, and that historical archaeology with the complementary archaeological record, documentary record, really has quite a contribution to make, and we hope to build on that and continue to demonstrate that in the books.
Yeah, and I would add to that by saying I think the book does a good job of demonstrating how the practice of historical archaeology is ever evolving. It's grown and changed over time, and the scope of questions it asks are always changing and made relevant to the moment we're living in. And the application of historical archaeology is extending outside of the boundaries of the subdiscipline to include interactions with the field of historic preservation and above ground preservation, with environmental science, with policy and community development. So I think that's an important takeaway from the book, to show that the field is very vibrant and adaptive. And that's something that is not necessarily well captured in the federal level legislation that guides our preservation practices. The NHPA was passed in 1966, and the Society for Historical Archaeology was established the next year. So the historic preservation industry is structured around an understanding of archaeology that predates the formalization of historical archaeology. So that's always something that we historical archaeologists are slightly evangelical about, to say, hey, we can be useful to all historic preservation initiatives and projects. And hopefully that's a takeaway, educational takeaway of this book.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to next question. Dean, you were listing many of the historical archaeologists who have been active in Michigan through the years. What are the museums and academic programs that have been most involved?
There are a number of them, and I'll start with the one I know best, which is Michigan University, because that is back in the days when Professor Moreau Maxwell was there. Maxwell was involved in some of the very early work at Michigan-Mackinac, and upon his departure for a sabbatical, Chuck Cleland became a faculty member there, and it was Chuck who really launched the historical archaeology program, which continues to this day. I'll let Krysta say more about Wayne State, but Wayne State has been crucial in the history of academic institutions with historical archaeology programs. I would also mention Michigan Technological University, which has a very strong industrial archaeology program, and is a relatively smaller university, is quite a leader in that field globally, in fact. And those are the main ones I can think of. Krysta, if you want to say something about Wayne, or if I've left something out.
Yeah, no, I think in terms of the universities that grant graduate degrees in archaeology or anthropology, those are the big three for sure, and have been well established for decades. But let's not leave out Michael's university, Western Michigan University. During the period that he was there, they were absolutely a leader in establishing the Fort St. Joseph project, and that field school's been going on for like 40 years now. So they established some models of best practice that have influenced the entire field, not just archaeology in Michigan. And we're not excluding the fact that there are other academic institutions that have historical archaeologists at them. There are many across the state, but traditionally, those are the schools that have produced the most practitioners who have gone on to advance the field all around the world. Yeah, so, and we do actually talk about that in more detail and more accuracy in the second chapter of the book.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What was your process in writing with three authors? Was each chapter overviewed by you three, or were each of you contributing to specific chapters based on your expertise?
Well, the latter part of that question sounds like it should be the answer, right? A neat and tidy, you write this chapter, I write this chapter, but in retrospect, it's more of a ball of yarn at this point. And well, I'll let Michael and Dean answer the real part of the question, but I'll put a cherry on top first by saying that it was our intention to sound like it was written in one voice, for the book to sound like it was written with one voice. So one of you want to say how we got there?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'll let the reader be the judge of whether it does indeed read with one voice. But yeah, we as I mentioned earlier, that we complement each other because we have worked on different sites, we have different interests, where we have different pedagogical pedigrees as well, different training and so forth. So I think there were different chunks of it, I think, that occurred to us, but each and every one of the chapters was, well, I would say chapters 3, 4, and 5 were closely co-authored by Dean and I. The chapter on collaboration, Krysta and I collaborated on. Dean predominantly wrote the chapter on the pioneers in historical archaeology with contributions from Krysta. And then the first and final chapters were collaborative work. So enough said.
Yeah.
We're still talking to each other, if that's what your question was really designed to ascertain, whether we have a harmonious relationship. The answer is yes. Yes.
Okay, I'm glad you are. So next question. Is there any cooperation with developers in new construction and archaeologists in the city of Detroit area?
Yes, all the time. This is if development is taking place with federal dollars or on state or federal land, it's mandated by law. But in fact, partially as a result of some controversies that archaeologists were involved in unearthing years ago, like the Halleck Street log cabin that was sadly demolished during a land bank clearance event. As a result of some of the oversights in historic preservation over time and community consultation, the city of Detroit established a community benefits ordinance, which requires developers who are spending over a certain amount on their development, I think it's $1 billion, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, to consult with community stakeholders. So if a development is taking place in a particular neighborhood, a neighborhood association or other neighborhood constellation of stakeholders will be appointed and invited to comment on what they see as appropriate research or needs for that area. And in some cases, there have been requests for studies of historic districts or places where historic markers might go up. And just last semester, and I forgot to say, the developer has to fund that work. So if the community suggests that they'd like an inventory of historic properties in their neighborhood, the developer will kick in a certain amount of money to hire a consultant to do that work. So just last spring, in fact, my students and I in my historical archaeology class were funded by a developer to do a historic archaeological study of an area that's going to be impacted by development. And I can tell you more about that offline, whoever asked. Yeah.
Hey, cool. Thank you. Let's move on to next question. Structures are sometimes moved to be preserved, but may leave behind archaeological components. What advice do you have for groups that must move a historic structure?
Dean, that sounds like a question that someone would have called you to ask.
Yeah. it would certainly be in the best interest of any archaeological deposits that might be associated with a standing structure to have a good look at that property before the structure is moved or any work is done to prepare to move the structure. Anything that's going to be ground disturbing around the structure and not just immediately adjacent to the structure, but in the case of the possibility that there may be other buildings, outbuildings, privies, anything nearby that could be affected by the physical process of moving the structure. It's also, is what Krysta has talked about, worth looking inside the structure before it's moved in terms of what might be underneath floorboards, what might be in a basement or even under a basement. And it's even perhaps the not as likely prospect that before something is moved, you may find what could be considered archaeological deposits in the wall. So there are any number of things that could and should perhaps be taken into account before you begin to move a structure.
You know, with that said, too, I mean, archaeology is often, in that instance, it sounds like, you know, maybe the archaeologist learns of the movement. It's going to happen like in 3 weeks. You know, so the work is like triage. Um, you know, we worked on a site in Battle Creek where we were able to do some subsurface investigations, and it's a 1850s great brick Greek revival house of Battle Creek's first school teacher. The place was like falling down. It wasn't so much it was going to be moved, it probably was going to be knocked down at some point. And then someone stepped in and they completely rehabilitated the place, restored it, and in the course of doing that, I mean, it's a beautiful building now, and I commend them for doing it. And it'll have a historical marker soon as well. We're waiting to hear when that will happen. But at the same time, there were landscape changes that we know that probably destroyed archaeological deposits. So, you know, we're never going to get it all. We do the best we can with limited time and resources and so on. And you know, those kind of salvage situations are often, if that in fact is in fact what that is, then it's often difficult.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What have been the most important finds at the Malcolm X house site?
Well, that's a great question. And I suppose it depends on who you ask. I think the archaeologists and maybe some of the community stakeholders might have different interpretations of that. You know, we did archaeology there. We never just do archaeology for the purpose of digging and seeing what might be there. You always have very particular questions in mind. And when we began the archaeology there, our intention was to dig around the foundation of the house and the porch area to find remnants of the house that dated to the period when Malcolm X and his family lived there in the early 1950s, because the money was already in place from a grant to restore the house. But from that early 1950s period, all that the property owners had were black and white pictures of the house. So the question of restoring the house, well, there are a lot of unanswered questions, like what color was the siding? What did the light fixtures look like? And so on and so forth. And, you know, based on our experience excavating in domestic structures previously, we approximated that we would find some bits and pieces of older iterations of the house, and we did. And so I thought it was really important contribution that we were able to contribute information that aided in the accurate reconstruction of the house. Lamps, address block, what color the paint was on the home, and so forth. But we were also interested in recovering everyday objects, material culture, you know, things people threw out or dropped from that period of the early 1950s that we could interpret to learn more about what life was like for the little family. That was the surname of the family who lived there. And there was a lot of oral history surrounding the site, and oral history is an important source of information for historical archaeology projects. And one of those sources of oral history said that Malcolm used to spend quite a lot of time on the front porch, socializing and exercising and reading and so on. Tiny little front porch. And he only lived in the home from 1952 to 1953. So we had to go into that project emphasizing that it was very unlikely that archaeologists would be able to find an artifact that equated directly, that we could say was used by Malcolm X. You know, here is the pen that he wrote this paper with, or something like that. But lo and behold, on our very last day, right next to the porch, from a very deep deposit, we excavated a penny, and the date on it was 1952. And so can we correlate that with Malcolm X in a definitive way? No, but the suggestion that it might have fallen out of his pocket, or it was at least present at the time when he lived there, it was very powerful. So I think that has probably become the most poignant find from the excavations, which is really interesting, because I think if any of us, Dean or Michael or I, or any of the other archaeologists listening in to this webinar, found a 1952 penny on any other site, we'd kind of just toss it into the modern materials bag and not think about it again. So that just goes to show how the kind of the context of a site is everything when it comes to interpreting the artifacts.
Thank you. Next question. At the Bluebird, didn't you do some above ground historical archaeology? For example, in the rafters of the building, under the stage, or behind the kitchen equipment?
Yes, and that's what the picture I showed you in the slideshow was conveying. And I'll answer more about that, or I'll point you to the book to read a little bit more about that. But I'll tell you very quickly. There was a cache of 2,000 documents stowed away in the ceiling above the entryway vestibule to the Bluebird. And that was the real archaeological treasure there. They were stapled by the day of the week. They encapsulated a period of business from 1948 to 1949. The women who did the accounting for the Bluebird were fastidious record keepers. So every business interaction they had, from buying soda pop and chicken for the restaurant to paying the musicians, was recorded in that document cache. So yes, the short answer is yes, but you can read all about it in the book.
Cool. Okay, so next question. You might have mentioned it a little bit already, but would you briefly note how each of yours theoretical perspective work together to shape the structure and content of this book?
I think we tried to identify some themes at the beginning of the writing process, and then other themes emerge. But in terms of our theoretical perspectives, I mean, let me just speak for myself. The work that I've been doing for some time has been very much influenced by a critical theory. And so I asked myself the sorts of interpretations that archaeologists have offered often serve particular purposes. And so where do those emanate from? So how can we contextualize those interpretations? And what we see is that over time, social and political circumstances change, and not only is there more data, but as a result, then those interpretations ultimately change. So, again, another piece of it, I mentioned earlier, decolonization. We've been trying to center Native experience. So certainly in the 17th, 18th century, when we sort of think about Native roles and so on, it kind of pushes up against some of the interpretations that saw the French, for example, as quite dominant in various spheres and so on, and allows us to give more voice to Native agency. So I think that's some of what informed at least the early part of the book.
I think we'll stick with Michael's answers. I think you can kind of see in general, the book is not driven by our individual theoretical perspectives. Rather, it kind of encapsulates demonstrations of theoretical interpretations in historical archaeology. So there's moments where you can see discussions on colonialism or decolonization, and moments where you see discussions on interpretation of class or race or gender, and so on and so forth. So we're not trying to advance a particular theoretical perspective here. And there was never a moment in writing the book where the three of us got together and said to each other, what's our theoretical perspectives? Let's make them gel on this topic. You know, I think some of us sort of run for the hills if that were the case.
I was going to say essentially the same thing. I don't ever recall a specific theoretical conversation amongst the three of us. It all just sort of developed organically in terms of the things Michael's talking about, thinking about descendant communities and collaboration. I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. It seems like Dean were cutting up a little bit at the end of his sentence. Were you hearing him fine?
Oh,
Okay, anyways, let's move on to next question. We still have quite a few questions. If you have, so this webinar is being recorded. You can always come back to listen to this if you have to leave right now. So let's move on to the next questions. So when you have students and interns that work with you, what roles do they play on sites?
Well, let me answer briefly. I'm not actively involved in training students anymore, but I did so for many, many years. I could say at the Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project, we trained scores of students to do archaeological fieldwork and lab work. Many of them followed up with independent study, working in the lab, processing artifacts and the like. Some of them wrote honors theses and master's theses that I supervised and so on. They had internships as well, where we trained them or engaged in capacity building and so forth, so they could begin to do the work independently on their own. And so this went on for many, many years. And it continues to go on with that project at Western Michigan University. I suspect that MSU and Wayne State do similar things.
Yeah, as the one who is still teaching students in our group, all of those things are ways we involve students from the first course they take all the way through dissertation work and internships and museum experience. Yeah.
And I would say it was a little bit different for me. We had interns that worked with us in state government, and a lot of what I think people gained from that was knowledge of the archaeological record across many different parts of the state, and what was the archaeological site file that's housed in the State Historic Preservation Office at this point. The breadth of archaeological information that holds, and also insight into the legal framework deals with archaeology at state and a federal level. Because we did so much of that in the course of our daily jobs, interns got a lot of exposure to that, for better or worse, or interesting or not so much, but there was a lot of that sort of background gained by the interns who worked.
Okay, thank you. So there are a few questions about the SHA. Maybe that will be our last questions. First of all, so MHPN was so pleased to recently honor Dr. Jen Reschler with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Does the SHA have a means to honor its own?
Yes, absolutely. Congratulations, Jan, first of all. That's a huge deal. The SHA has several awards that it issues. The most prestigious, which sounds like the equivalent of the MHPN, is called the Harrington Award for Lifetime Achievement in Historical Archaeology Scholarship. And there have been, to my knowledge, but this may be incomplete, 3 Michigan trained archaeologists who have won that award: Chuck Cleland, George Miller, who came out of Wayne State, and Chuck Orser. Am I missing anybody? I think
Pilling did too, I believe.
Did he? He might have. Yeah. So there've been a fairly
Virgil Noble also.
Oh, Virgil Noble too. So we've kind of cornered the market as much as any state for producing archaeologists who are getting that Lifetime Achievement Award. There's also awards for, best books written, public engagement, and a number of others. So we do like to give awards. And I see there's a question more about the SHA conference. Do you want me to? I'm co-organizing the conference, so I can anyone can contact me with specific logistical questions. But the question in the chat is, can a non-professional attend and find programming? And the answer is absolutely. There's different rates of registration depending on whether you're a member or not, or a student or a professional or retired. So check out their webpage, sha.org, for that. Also, and the sessions are, these are academic papers, but they're generally understandable. And some of the sessions are geared around engaging the public, or other case studies that you don't need to have a PhD to understand. There's also always one day of the conference dedicated to public archaeology. And so we will be hosting a public archaeology day. So there'll be exhibitors from universities and museums and government institutions all across the state. And they'll be showing off archaeology, their findings, handing out swag, you name it. And it'll be hosted on the campus of Wayne State at our Museum of Anthropology on Saturday, January 10th. And that is free to attend. It is being co-hosted by Wayne State and the Michigan History Center, and Stacy Czorzinski, who organizes Michigan Archaeology Day, which is this Saturday, October 18th, at the Michigan History Center. She's one of the co-organizers of the SHA Public Archaeology Days. So if you're familiar with Michigan Archaeology Day in Lansing, which all of us participate in routinely, that will be coming to Detroit. So spread the word. Everyone's welcome, and you don't have to pay for that.
And
Awesome.
can we step back for just a moment to SHA recognition? Krysta's book, Detroit Remains, received the Jim Dietz Book Award and that's a pretty big deal.
Wow, congratulations. Okay, I think so we should probably wrap up here, and sorry we didn't get to answer all the questions, but you are always welcome to ask more questions afterwards. Just email me or one of the speakers. So this webinar is being recorded. You will receive the link to the recording in the next couple of days. That will come from me. So if you have any questions, just reply to that email. And please participate in the survey to help us improve our webinar. And I want to just quickly announce our next webinar, which is scheduled for November 13th. It's also Thursday at 1 p.m. And we have invited Melissa Milton-Pond from the Michigan Municipal League to talk about the pattern book homes for 21st century Michigan. And I hope to see you all there next time. And a very big thank you to our speakers. Again, thank you so much for your time and for your putting together this presentation for us. And we really look forward to this book being published in January.
So, thank you to the network for inviting us to do this.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.